Hello, my name's Jane Kenney from Gwynedd Archaeological Trust, and this is a talk for the Friends of Gwynedd Archaeological Trust. I'm going to be looking at the Neolithic period in northwest Wales. To start with, I want to give some context. There were glaciers all the way across northern Britain and most of Wales, and Britain was connected to the continent because the glaciers had reduced the sea level so far. This is a very useful map that's not even been published yet, and this shows how the glaciers retreated. And if you can see, 26,000 years ago, Wales was already appearing from under the glaciers. 20,000 years ago, the glaciers only over Snowdonia. And 18,000 years ago, Wales was free of ice and there were only glaciers up in northern Scotland. This gave plenty of time at the end of the Ice Age for Upper Paleolithic people to colonise Britain, and they spread right up into Scotland. We get very little evidence of them in North Wales, but occasionally you find some traces like the decorated horse jaw from Kendrick Cavern and the Great Orme. So the climate was warming slowly at the end of the Ice Age, but around 10,800 BC, it got dramatically colder again, and there was a cold snap for about 1,000 years, known as Lochloman Stadial or Younger Dryas. And during this time, the glaciers returned to Snowdonia and to the Scottish Highlands, and it became so cold that people left Britain. About 9,600 BC, the climate started to warm again. And in fact, the warming was so rapid that people at the time would actually have realised that the climate was changing. And this was the start of the Holocene, the era that we're in at the moment, which is basically an interglacial period. And the tundra vegetation that had covered Britain at the end of the Ice Age started to change, becoming scrubland with birch and hazel. And then the oak woodland started to spread across the country. So you get mixed oak woodland across Britain. And into this oak woodland came woodland animals, various kinds of deer, aurochs, the giant wild cattle, wild boar, bear and wolves, and other smaller animals, including beaver. And into this new woodland came hunter-gatherers, people moving back into Britain, and this was the period that archaeologists know as the Mesolithic period, from about 9,600 to 4,000 BC. People at this time, as I say, were hunter-gatherers. They lived in small groups, hunted wild animals, gathered plants, collected shellfish, and fished for fish in the sea and the rivers. They tended to move around their territory, exploiting resources at appropriate times of year. We do have some evidence of the houses that they lived in Britain. I suspect that often they used very temporary shelters, but some houses that were used over quite a long period of time have been excavated, though I think they were probably used seasonally and continually rebuilt. And here in this drawing you can actually see some of these quite small houses that would have been used at this time. So that's what was going on in Britain at the end of the last Ice Age. If we look at the Middle East, things were quite different. Obviously in the Middle East, the glaciers had no direct impact, but the changes in climate certainly did. This is an area known as the Fertile Crescent by archaeologists, running through Israel, Syria, Turkey, and into Iran. And this is an area where you actually had wild cereals growing, wheat and barley, and wild sheep and goat as well as other wild species such as gazelle. And in the, as the climate was warming slowly at the end of the Ice Age, this area became milder and wetter, and really quite rich in resources that the local people started to develop settled settlements and much more complex cultures, and their populations increased using these rich resources in the area. But when the Younger Dryas, the cold snap, happened, the climate changed to become cooler and much drier, and there was fewer resources available. So to support the higher populations and their settlements, they had to intensify their use of resources. And this intensification led to the development of agriculture, to the domestication of cereals and the domestication of sheep and goat. Or at least that was the original interpretation of what happened. This is the site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, really quite an extraordinary site that developed from 9600 BC, when the people in the area were hunter-gatherers. But this was a site with a whole series of temples built of stone with these massive monoliths that were decorated and engraved, kind of site that really hunter-gatherers should not have been creating. But in this place they did. This would have involved a lot of people to actually build these temples, and presumably a lot of people gathering to use them. And the argument is that actually this collection of people together for religious ritual purposes actually may have led to the development of agriculture. However, agriculture developed here in the Fertile Crescent. It had appeared by 9500 BC, and then from there it spread out across into Europe, as well as elsewhere. There was one wave coming along the Mediterranean, and this possibly spread largely by local hunter-gatherers adopting agriculture. But there was also a wave going into Central Europe, and this almost certainly spread by population movement, people actually spreading into this area, which was heavily forested and probably fairly unoccupied at the time. And in Central Europe, these agriculture using communities, these Neolithic communities, developed into a culture known as the linear band ceramic, after their pottery, which is decorated by linear bands. And this culture was particularly represented by villages of these massive houses, timber-built houses with timbers set in post holes, and some of these houses were up to 60 meters long, and this culture existed. Its height was about 500 to 5000 BC. So you had the linear band ceramic culture in Central Europe, and by 5000 BC, farming cultures had spread to the shore of the Channel. By this point, there was a channel, English Channel in existence, and Britain was an island, as the sea levels had risen after the ice melted at the end of the Ice Age. But the Channel itself really shouldn't have been much of a barrier to the spread of agriculture. However, there was 1,000 years between agriculture arriving in northern France and it becoming adopted in Britain. Some other parts of Northern Europe also had this delay before agriculture spread into those areas. And the best dates we have for the appearance of the Neolithic and agriculture in Britain come from the Gathering Time project, which suggests that the first Neolithic cultures in Britain appeared in southeast Britain at perhaps just before 4000 BC, probably coming across from northeast France. And then very shortly after that, the Neolithic spread very rapidly all the way across Britain, arriving in the Northern and Western Isles probably about 3700 BC. Other people have interpreted things slightly differently. Arison Sheridan from the National Museum of Scotland would actually also see the Neolithic coming across from northeast France, and perhaps puts a little bit more emphasis on people travelling up the coast of Britain, and then the Neolithic coming across Scotland and into Ireland, and suggesting also other movement into Britain from northwest France at different times. It used to be considered that actually agriculture came into Britain by the local Mesolithic people adopting agriculture. Recent work on DNA analysis from actual remains from the Mesolithic and Neolithic is actually suggesting that there was a real movement of people into Britain at the start of the Neolithic. So it does look like that the agriculture was actually brought into Britain by people moving into Britain, though the Mesolithic people must have played some role in adopting it. So the Neolithic period in Britain runs from about 4000 BC to maybe 2500 BC. You can argue a little bit about exactly when it ends. And in this period, farming was the main indicator of the Neolithic, that you have domestic cereals, wheat and barley being grown, and these were certainly brought into Britain. They weren't domesticated in Britain because there's no wild wheat and barley in Britain. Similarly, they had domestic sheep and goats, and as there were no wild sheep and goats, these were also definitely brought into Britain. There were wild cattle and wild boar in Britain, but these were the large wild versions, and the first domesticated cattle and pig that found in Britain were much smaller domestic versions. There's no trace of a change from the wild to domestic actually happening in Britain. So you've got to see the cereal and all the domestic animals being brought across to Britain. So imagining people travelling across the Channel, probably in skin boats, and certainly they wouldn't have been bringing a full-grown bull across. They're probably bringing their animals across as young animals, as being much easier to transport. And we've seen that in Central Europe, they had very large timber-built houses. In the 1,000 years between the end of the linear band ceramic culture and the arrival of the Neolithic in Britain, on the continent, cultures had diversified rather more, and you had a lot of regional variants, most of which had timber houses, but perhaps slightly smaller ones than before and rather more varied. And it's this style of timber building that appears in Britain at the start of the Neolithic in Britain, and particularly in Scotland, where you have still really quite large buildings. This is Crathis in Aberdeenshire, and this is about 25 metres long, and some of the others that have been found are even larger. So these are really substantial buildings that have been built from the start of the Neolithic. In England, for a long while, the only one of these buildings that was known was Lismore Fields in Buxton in Derbyshire, but more of these are being found, including one of the earliest Neolithic, dated Neolithic sites in Britain. But it may be that there genuinely were much fewer of these in England than elsewhere in the British Isles. But there were certainly plenty in Ireland, and a large number of these have been found, perhaps rather smaller than the Scottish examples, but probably this was the style of building that was used in Wales. So you've got ties across the Irish Sea. As well as agriculture, there were other new developments that were brought into Britain in the Neolithic period. In the Mesolithic period, we don't really know what people were doing with their dead. We have a few that were deposited in caves, but most of the dead seem to have been disposed in ways that have left no archaeological trace. Certainly they were not building big monuments to their dead, whereas in the Neolithic period, from very close to the start of the Neolithic, monuments were built across Britain of various different sorts. So that was a big change to the landscape of Britain. Also, new technologies were brought in, particularly pottery, which would have been seen as really quite a radical new technology, that you're turning just clay, just mud, through fire into these very useful vessels, which could be shaped in all sorts of different ways and gave you new containers to use. And also another type of artifact that was very distinctive of the Neolithic were stone axes. That in the Mesolithic period, people did use axes made of stone, and occasionally, especially South Wales, they ground the cutting edges of those axes. But in the Neolithic, axes were often ground and polished all over to give them a very distinctive finish and shape. So that gives you a background to the Neolithic across Britain and where it comes from. So now we'll look at northwest Wales in particular. The most obvious Neolithic monument in this area, and in fact across Britain, are chambered tombs. This is a distribution map of chambered tombs in northwest Wales. Often distribution maps just show how things have survived rather than where they were in the past. But you can see on this map that the tombs are concentrated on the lowlands, the coastal plains and valleys, and particularly on Anglesey. And I think this really does show where people were living in the Neolithic in this area, because if tombs had been built in the uplands, they still would have survived, because it's in the lowlands that they've been lost through agriculture. So I think this is really showing that the Neolithic people were using these lowlands, which were better for agriculture, and particularly this concentration on Anglesey, which is probably because this is the area with the best agricultural land in our region, but perhaps because Anglesey was an island and there was something special about it. The tombs across Anglesey are really quite varied and often don't fit into nice classification of tombs. Here we have Bryn Hen Bobl, which was a kidney-shaped mound with underneath a small chamber, which is particularly unusual because the chamber was blocked by a stone slab. That has been broken so that people could get into the chamber much more recently. But you can still actually see that there were actually holes in that stone slab, perhaps so that offerings could be put in for the dead. Here's Pantysaia, which was really quite a typical chamber, which probably would have had a circular mound. And this is Cligwy, which had this massive capstone with really quite small supporting stones around it. So very very different kinds of forms of chamber, but they had various things in common. One being that all these examples were excavated in the earlier 20th century, so perhaps not to our kinds of standards, though certainly Pantysia was excavated really quite carefully. And another thing is that these were not the burial for single individuals. In all these, the remains of many individuals found. In Pantysia, there were actually the remains of 54 individuals, men, women and children. In Clygwi, counting by the human jaws that were found, there was at least 12 individuals. And in Bryn Hen Bobl, it is recorded that there were scores of individuals. These weren't whole burials, they were quite disturbed fragments of different burials. In these cases, this is partly because these tombs themselves were quite disturbed, but even where you get Neolithic tombs that have been entirely undisturbed, it's very rare to find whole skeletons. That it seems that when somebody died, they were either placed in the tomb until the body had been turned into a skeleton, or were actually placed somewhere outside so that birds and animals could pick the skeleton clean, and then it was placed in the tomb. And then as new burials were deposited, the existing ones in the tomb were moved around. Perhaps you'd have a pile of skulls in one corner, long bones put together, so they were moved around, mixed up. And often, even then, even though they're mixed up, you don't find the bones representing a complete individual, but it seems that bones were often removed from the tomb, perhaps used as relics or some kind of magical talisman, and it almost seems as if the individual dead bodies were converted into representatives of the ancestors in these tombs. Here's another tomb on Anglesey. This is the Trevignath tomb at Holyhead. And this is one tomb that was excavated in more recent years and to modern standards. This was excavated in the 1970s. And although this tomb was quite disturbed by robbing for stone for field boundaries and such like, there was enough to actually show that it had actually been built in a series of phases, starting off with a simple passage tomb with a circular cairn, and then being converted into a long cairn with a rectangular chamber, and then another chamber being added and the cairn extended with these earlier chambers probably being blocked. So this shows that even now, when you seem to have this single monument, a lot of these actually had quite a long, complicated history to them. So there are many tombs on Anglesey, but there are also some on the mainland. Here's one in the Conwy Valley. This is Minor Bath above Rowan, which is particularly one of my favourites because this is the symbol for the Gwynedd Archaeological Trust. But most people don't know there are actually two tombs at Minor Bath. Not far from the well-known one, there is another tomb, and this has a chamber in one end, and then it would have had a long cairn running behind that. So this is quite different to the well-known tomb, which probably had a circular cairn. And this one is actually largely buried under soil, which is built up here from a field built against it, used from at least the Iron Age. So here you have two quite different tombs together in proximity. The other area that has quite a concentration of tombs is Dyffryn Ard Idwy, between Harlech and Barmouth. And here you've got two tombs very close together. This is Caernarfon Hen Gwm, where you've got two long cairns very close together. And one of these was excavated in the 1920s, but we really don't have enough information to know how these tombs were used together, but clearly they were present in the landscape at the same time. These were also badly robbed out for field walls. You can actually see the field walls in this area where the stone has been reused. And in the village of Dyffryn Ar Dydwy itself, there is also quite a complex chamber tomb, and not far away at gogledd-orllewin, there's a tomb which has largely collapsed with just a capstone propped up on one of the side slabs. So all these tombs that we've looked at probably actually belong to the earlier part of the Neolithic. Really, these are mostly only dated by pottery found in them, and often not even that, but their style suggests they're earlier. In the later part of the Neolithic, you tend to get new styles of tombs coming in that seem to be connected to quite a wide area, particularly to Ireland. So these are passage graves, which have similarities to Newgrange and the other large passage tombs in Ireland, and also similarities to Maes Howe on Orkney, which gives you an idea of the wide range of the connections of these. In northwest Wales, these are present on Anglesey at Archaeolegol Gwynedd, on the coast, west coast of Anglesey. And here you can see a circular mound around the tomb, and this has decorated stones with the passage grave art, which these types of tombs are particularly known for. There's also Bryncathley, which is very well known, and this also had passage grave art on a stone which was found lying down behind the chamber, but would originally have been a standing stone. This monument is a little bit difficult to understand at the moment. There was a circular ditch here, which the mound would actually have covered this whole area inside the ditch, and in fact partly filled up the ditch, whereas the reconstruction of the chamber in the mound actually only has a small mound here just to support the chamber itself. There is a theory that the circular ditch was actually a different kind of monument known as a henge, and would have had a bank around the outside of it, and then the tomb was built over the top of that, putting it out of use. Though there's also a theory that the circular ditch was actually an earlier phase actually of building the chambered tomb itself. Some of these passage graves elsewhere, particularly Newgrange in Ireland and Maes Howe, have solar alignments. The alignment at Newgrange is on the midwinter solstice sunrise. At Maes Howe, the alignment is on the midwinter solstice sunset, and it was speculated that Bryncathley also had a solar alignment. And in 2006, Steve Burrow of the National Museum of Wales established that this was in fact the case, and this is aligned on midsummer solstice sunrise. And Cadw now have an event to actually celebrate this solar alignment. So you have all these tombs scattered across the area, but in the Neolithic period there were also other monuments. In the earlier Neolithic period, the typical monument that was used for gatherings was the causewayed enclosure, where you had an area defined by various short sections of ditches. In northwest Wales, there don't seem to have been causeways and enclosures. The only possible example that has been suggested was a site on Anglesey known as Bryncethley Wen, and that has recently been proved not to have been a causewayed enclosure. But later on in the Neolithic, other big monuments developed, particularly henges, which I've just mentioned, the possible henge at Bryncethley Thee. And often these were very large monuments, up to about 90 metres in diameter, with a circular ditch, typically with a bank outside the ditch, and often with opposed entrances, 2 or 4 entrances into it. And here is an aerial photograph of the site of the Llandigau industrial estate just outside Bangor before that was built. And here you can see very clearly these 2 big circular monuments here, and these were proved to be henges. Also on this site you can see these parallel lines with a rounded end here, and in fact this carries on under the cricket pitch here, and this was another kind of Neolithic monument known as a cursus, which was defined by these parallel ditches and was probably a monument for procession along it, and this may have dated a little bit earlier than the 2 henges. So here you've got a site with really quite a collection of important monuments, and this was dug in the 1960s before the industrial estate was built. Nowadays, when we have developer funding to do these kinds of big sites, we would have stripped the plough soil of this whole area and would have excavated everything important that we could see. Back in the 1960s, they didn't have that, they didn't have the money, and they didn't have the time. So these monuments weren't excavated entirely, only certain parts of them were excavated, but certainly enough to show that these were big henge monuments with quite a lot going on around them. And the cursus here, which then actually had an early medieval cemetery dug across it. Though we were actually investigating a small area outside what is now Screwfix a few years ago, and actually found that although the industrial estate has been built across this site, in some areas that haven't been levelled, like parts of where the cursus was, the cursus ditches and some of the graves dug across it actually do still survive as buried archaeology. On Anglesey, it appears that there probably was also another henge there. This is Castell Bryn Gwyn, and this is a site with a large bank and ditch, which is quite impressive to visit now. What you can actually see now is almost entirely an Iron Age bank and ditch. But Francis Lynch has suggested that actually this is built over a Neolithic henge. Back in the 1960s, some excavation was done on this site, and they found that as well as the bank that can be seen, there was an earlier bank and ditch there. And in fact, instead of Iron Age pottery within the area, they only found Neolithic pottery. So this site was definitely used in the Neolithic period. And Francis has suggested there was actually a bank and ditch forming a henge, and there were 2 opposing entrances through that, one of which has been largely built over by the present farm. So this does seem to have been a henge site, and this is quite an important area that you have Castell Bryn Gwyn as a henge there. Bryncethley Thee is not far up the valley here, and antiquarian reports suggested there was a stone circle just nearby, and the other way there are the Bryn Gwyn stones. These are really quite impressive stones. You can see there's 2 of them surviving, really massive. Here is George Smith with his team of volunteers standing in front of the biggest stone, to show you the height of that stone. And in fact, you can see these little notches in the top of the stone. That's because this was so big, it was actually used as the gable end of a cottage in the 18th century, and these notches actually took the roof beams of the cottage. And antiquarian reports suggested that this was originally a stone circle, although we've only got the two stones actually still standing now. And George Smith investigated this and excavated an area which showed that, in fact, this really was a stone circle, really quite small with large stones in it. The large size of the stones suggests that this actually was Neolithic in date, that we have quite a few stone circles in our area, but most of those are Bronze Age, but they all have really quite small stones. There certainly was some Bronze Age dates that came out from this stone circle from a pit in the middle, but the large size of the stones suggests that it was late Neolithic in date. And in fact, there were some cremation burials that produced a late Neolithic date and other late Neolithic dates from this. So the stone circle itself was probably built towards the end of the Neolithic period. So these are monuments that were built in the Neolithic, but where were these people living in the Neolithic period? We've seen that elsewhere in Britain you get, right at the start of the Neolithic, rectangular timber buildings. There were a few of these that were found in Wales, down in Pembrokeshire, at Cleggerboia, at Gwynedd in Powys, and Moelagara in Flintshire. The one on Cleggerboia was really quite small, rectangular, but not quite typical of what are usually quite big buildings. Moelagara is an Iron Age hill fort, which was extensively excavated, but Bill Britnell has suggested that some of the post holes on there actually belonged to a Neolithic building, and certainly it forms a shape very like a lot of the Neolithic buildings. At Gwynedd, there was a Neolithic chambered tomb, which was excavated by Bill Britnell, and under that there were remains of some kind of timber structure. And Bill has been looking at this recently, and certainly thinks that this was also a Neolithic rectangular timber building, and is going to be talking about this in early March. So we have a few examples that have been known about for quite a long time, but if you want to see Neolithic rectangular timber buildings in northwest Wales, you have to, in Wales, you have to come to the northwest, right up in our area, where you have two examples at Llandigau, only 500 metres apart, one at Parc Cybi, and then the site at Llanfaethley, where they had actually four examples of these buildings. So here are the Llandigau ones, as I say, found 500 metres apart, and the one of the ones at Llandigau was actually found at the industrial estate site that we looked at with the henges, and in fact was underneath just the edge of one of the henges. That's the henge ditch, just cutting it there, and it would have been buried underneath the henge bank. And here's the one from Holyhead, from the site of Parc Cybi. And if we look at these, you can see that they've got a very similar plan, especially if you ignore this end of the Parc Cybi one, which I think was a slightly later addition. You can see that they've all got these parallel rows of posts, which would be aisle posts supporting the roof, and then post holes for the walls. The one under the industrial estate is slightly less well preserved, but there's still just about traces of the walls there. And you can see they all have one larger compartment at the eastern or northeastern end, and then the aisle post holes closer together at the western end, and certainly at Parc Bryn Cegin and Parc Cybi, there are traces of partitions between these aisle post holes. And then, sorry, I was just going to mention also, these are aligned with north to the top, and you can actually see how close the alignment is between the Parc Bryn Cegin and the Parc Cybi houses, with the one at Llandegau Industrial Estate just on a slightly different alignment. So this does rather suggest that there's something important about these alignments. Llanfaethley is on the north coast of Anglesey, and this is an extraordinary site because usually you find these houses, these rectangular timber buildings, just isolated on their own. Here you've got a group of 4. You can see here, there's 2 here, there's 1 here which was largely obscured under later Neolithic pits. And then here is what is probably the southern end of a really massive house, which carried on outside the excavated area. So here you have a group of houses. Possibly we can start talking about a village. The post-excavation work on this is ongoing, and there are new insights to this coming out all the time. Here we have some photographs showing what these look like on the ground. You can see here the excavated post holes here, where the posts would be to support the building. And here is a reconstruction to give you an idea what these would actually have looked like as they were being used. This is a reconstruction of the building at Parc Cybi. And you can see these are really quite massive buildings, big enough perhaps to be thought of as halls rather than just houses, though quite how they were used, whether these were just domestic buildings or whether they had other uses and other significances, archaeologists have been arguing for quite a long while. Certainly people were living in these buildings. There are domestic rubbish found in quite a lot of them. Here we have some remains from the one at Parc Cybi. You get stone tools and flakes of stone, flint and chert. Here there was also a saddle quern for grinding grain. But you also find a few more unusual artifacts. There were some flakes of absolutely clear quartz crystal, including this example, which has actually been worked into a tiny tool. This is actually very, very small, only less than a centimetre long. There weren't any stone axes found in the Parc Cybi building, but there were flakes from stone axes, where flakes had been taken off these. Also, lots of pottery. This is some of the first pottery that was made in Wales, but it was actually very well made. This is quite finely made pottery in these round-bottomed vessels, quite thin-walled and quite well fired, but not decorated. And also at Parc Cybi, in a post hole just outside the building, there was this extraordinary object found. Here you've got 2 views, front and back, of what is actually an unfinished bead. And this is made out of cannel coal, but it's clearly been chosen to look like jet. And this was made at the same time as the building was in use, because we've actually got dates from the post hole that it was found in. So the dates of the building itself, that two of these buildings that have been well dated are the ones at Parc Cybi and Parc at Llandigau, and these date from about 3700 BC, and they were used for maybe 2 or 3 generations, not much longer. And this is the case for a lot of these buildings across Britain and Ireland, that they were used for a relatively short time, considering that buildings of these types could have been used for centuries, and were all built over a small number of centuries, maybe only 1 or 2 centuries, close to the start of the Neolithic. And the Parc Cybi building is of particular interest as well because of its relationship to the Trevignith chamber tomb. The building was actually not far from the tomb and was actually aligned on the first phase of that chamber tomb, and then the tomb took on that alignment of the building. And I have tried to argue that this is perhaps marking a festival in spring, sometime in April, perhaps something similar to our Easter, and possibly the Neolithic building was particularly used perhaps for gatherings at this festival, but this is getting very speculative. So you get these buildings in the earlier part of the Neolithic, probably very soon after the Neolithic period starts in northwest Wales. But later on, certainly after about 3600, these big buildings are not built anymore. And people seem to have returned to living in really quite small buildings, like this one, which is a reconstruction of ones found at Durrington Walls in Wiltshire. Probably sort of substantial enough, but really not much more than huts. In northwest Wales, we don't find anything quite like the Durrington Wall buildings, but we do find things that were probably not that dissimilar. The classic site for buildings of this type in Wales is Trelliston in Powys, where in the 1980s, underneath a Bronze Age cairn, 2 small late Neolithic buildings were found, and these had square hearths in the middle, with stones defining the edge of the hearths, and the walls were defined by stakes. And these are suggested reconstructions for these buildings, suggested by Bill Britlow. And I think we probably have quite a few examples of these in northwest Wales, but usually the walls of these buildings don't survive at all, and all you get are little pits like this, which don't look very impressive when you first start excavating them. And on Parc Cybi in particular, we found quite a few groups of these little pits. And I think certainly these are actually marking the locations of buildings. You can see that some of these, you have quite an arc of pits here, and these would fit nicely into little circular buildings about 5 meters across. And in this case, I think we've got 2 successive buildings here with pits inside. And across Parc Cybi, these dated from, starting from about 3300 BC, and then you've got some a little bit later on in the Neolithic. Here you've got, again, an arc of pits, which were probably inside a building. And right at the end of the Neolithic, we actually found a rectangular hearth very similar to those at Trelliston. And I think I've sort of reconstructed this as having a wall built of stakes, just like the Trelliston ones. So I think these were small, sort of circular or semicircular, subcircular buildings. Right at the very, very end of the Neolithic, we have a building which was square or sort of more rectangular in shape. This is so late that it could actually be counted as belonging to the following Beaker period. But we had no Beaker pottery just in this area, but we did have some late Neolithic pottery scattered about. So I'm claiming this one for the Neolithic period. And certainly in most of these pits, which are marking these small huts, you find plenty of pottery. Unlike the early Neolithic pottery, this is really quite crudely made. It's usually a lot thicker and not as well fired, but very heavily decorated. You also find domestic rubbish, flint and chert tools and flakes, as well as charcoal and fragments of burnt bone. So this actually seems to be domestic waste, actually probably from rubbish dumps that have been deposited into these pits. This kind of waste from rubbish dumps or middens actually should be good compost and should be spread on the fields or gardens. So why they were depositing this in pits, which they seem actually to have done all the way across Britain, is not entirely clear, but it's probably some kind of ritual activity using this valuable resource in this way. Also, you occasionally find some more valuable objects. Here are two different views of what we are calling a mace head, which may actually have been used on a haft through this hole as some kind of symbol of status, though it does actually have some battering on one end, so it does seem to have been used as a hammer to some extent, but this is a very well-made object and was probably not a purely practical object. And you find these little pits scattered all over wherever we've done larger scale excavations in this area. This is the example at Parc Clondigau, where you have, again, various little groups of pits, which I think probably would have been inside little buildings. And here is an arc of pits, and in fact that is associated with a few small stake holes, which may have been the surviving part of the wall of a building. On Anglesey as well, some were found at Penmynnydd on the route of a water pipeline. And again here you have an arc of pits with a few post holes scattered about. In a lot of cases, these pits have fairly simple fills, but in this example, here we've got sections through these pits, so showing the layers inside, and these darker layers showing where there's lots of charcoal, and in fact it seems that these pits were used as hearth pits, so you have various layers of burning inside these, as well as the usual pottery. Here's some really quite extravagantly decorated late Neolithic pottery. And in one of the post holes, there was actually also this typical Neolithic object, a stone axe. But in this case, the axe had been really quite badly used. It had been broken and reused and battered, and flakes taken off it, and then finally had ended up in a post hole as part of the post packing. This is still an example of one of these objects which are found very widely, and really one of the symbols of the Neolithic. These stone axes weren't hand axes at all. They were used in hafts, and here is an example from Cumbria, which was actually found still in its haft, to show how these would have been used. And they would have been swung like we use axes now for felling trees and cutting wood, as well as perhaps as quite status symbols, as quite valuable objects. And Northwest Wales is important as far as Neolithic axes go across Britain, because we have one of the main sources of stone for Neolithic axes in our area. Here we've got the quarry, Graig quarry above Penmaen Mawr, and this has eaten away in this rocky outcrop known as a Graig. And this is of stone which was used to produce stone axes. In fact, this whole hillside is this stone, a particular kind of volcanic rock, which was suitable for axes, especially along its margins where the stone was much finer grained. And it was first found that this stone was used for stone axes by Samuel Hazeldine Warren, who used to have holidays in Penmaen Mawr, and he carried out some excavations actually on the scree slopes below a Graig and found that the scree had been used to produce axes in the Neolithic period. But in the 1990s, Gwynedd Archaeological Trust and the Department of Continuing Education at Bangor University carried out some small-scale excavations right on the top of a Graig and found that the Neolithic people had also been actually quarrying some of the stone to produce axes. And here's an area where stone blocks have been levered out of the bedrock. And this had been then backfilled by stone axe production waste. And once that had been excavated out, the archaeologists found this rough out of a stone axe carefully placed in the bottom there. But it wasn't just a Graig above Penmaen Mawr, that above Llanfyfechan you have the hills of Garreg Fawr and Dinas, which are also the same kind of volcanic rock. And they also have scree, the scree below Garreg Fawr here, and Dinas, a lot of Dinas is covered with natural screes. And in both cases, the screes here were used as sources of stone for producing stone axes. And recently we have been investigating these other stone sources of the stone axes. And we're doing a project to investigate these as part of the Carnethe Landscape Partnership project scheme. And in 2019, we had some volunteers investigating the production of stone axes below Dinas. And once the coronavirus pandemic allows, we're going to get back to investigating these. But it's not just this area at around Llanfyfechan and Penmaen Mawr. There was another source of stone for stone axes down on Mynyddig on the Clun Peninsula above Porthnagle. And this was investigated in 2006 by Steve Burrow from the National Museum. And he found that the quarry in here for stone was much more widely spread than it had previously been assumed. And here people have been prizing out this sort of shattered bedrock and collecting pieces of this for the production of stone axes. So Mynyddig is right down here on the Clun Peninsula. And in fact, the stone axes produced from Mynyddig stone didn't travel very far from the source, that they're mainly around the Clun Peninsula and northwest Wales. The Graig source up on the north coast actually produced axes that were distributed across much of southern England and all of Wales, and I think probably went further north than shown on this map as well. These axes weren't distributed through trade really as we know it, but were probably distributed by gift exchange, that people would have exchanged these really quite valuable objects with other groups that they had connections with as gifts, and they were probably passed on across different groups. This still shows the connections between groups all the way across England and Wales, and shows that the connections that people living up in northwest Wales had right across the country in the Neolithic period. We really need to think about people here not being just isolated and provincial. I've been trying to avoid mentioning all the different styles of Neolithic pottery, but it's worth just looking at some of the names of these pottery styles. Archaeologists tend to name pottery styles after the site where that style was first described in detail, some of the Middle Neolithic pottery that we get here is known as Peterborough ware, and you get the Mortlake style and the Fengate style. Peterborough is in Cambridgeshire, and Fengate is a place just on the edge of Peterborough. Mortlake is a place on the edge of London. So these are styles that are named after sites excavated in eastern England. But the same kind of style was used right the way across Britain, including in northwest Wales. And it wasn't actually the pottery itself that was travelling, but it was the idea of what pots should look like, the actual shape of the pot itself, the kind of decoration that was used on these different styles of pottery. So this shows that these styles, these ideas, were spread right the way across Britain. In the later Neolithic, you get a style of pottery known as grooved ware, which is very typically these sort of bucket-shaped pots, decorated with grooved lines, hence the name. And this is a type of pottery that seems to have developed in Orkney, way beyond the north of Scotland, and then has spread in its use all the way across Britain, possibly spread with ideas about using henges and stone circles. So this really shows that that the people in Britain in the Neolithic and the people in northwest Wales had contacts and shared their ideas and shared their culture over the whole of the country, and weren't just isolated groups. So we've got to sort of think about our people in the Neolithic in northwest Wales with all these contacts and with quite a sophisticated culture. And remember that these are people that actually came across, their ancestors came across from the continent, really not that long before they were building these big houses in northwest Wales. So thank you very much. Thank you. Good night.